The final thing we need to do with all of our agreements are one of the higher end skills, which is comparison. So that is where we've got to compare similarities and differences between awards, enterprise agreements, and individual contracts. So let's start with an award and an enterprise agreement. What are the similarities? Well, both, if we start at basic level, both are employment contracts which outline the wages and conditions for employees. So that's an obvious one. But what else? Both are negotiated collectively for and on behalf of a group of employees rather than individually. So that's why we've been learning about individual contracts when they're not technically part of the course, because they show us that these are actually what we call collective agreements. They apply to a group of employees collectively. And both can involve a trade union in their negotiation. And finally, both are submitted to the Fair Work Commission before they can be ratified or approved. How are they different? Well, an award applies to all workers in a whole industry, whereas an enterprise agreement applies only to workers in one employer or business within that industry. Secondly, an award sets out the minimum conditions or safety net for an industry. It's kind of like the industry standard, the bare minimum, whereas an enterprise agreement must improve those conditions. They've got to leave the employee better off overall or pass that BOO test. And a trade union is essential and must be involved in negotiating an award. You can't have an award without a union, whereas they are an optional bargaining agent in an enterprise agreement and only there if requested by a majority of the employees within that business. What about an award and an individual contract? How are they similar? Well, there's not a lot of similarities, but we could say both are employment contracts which outline the wages and conditions of employees. So we can say that for all of them. That's an employment contract is basically what we're saying. And then I guess if we sort of had to find something, we could say they both must meet the minimum wage and the 10 National Employment Standards, or NES, as well. How are they different though? Well, there's a lot of differences. An award applies to all workers in an industry, whereas an individual contract is just for one employee. An award sets out the minimum conditions or safety net for an entire industry, whereas an individual contract must be an improvement on those conditions. It must pass that BOO, better off overall test. An award is negotiated collectively for a group of employees, whereas an individual contract is negotiated individually. So an award is quite literally for a collective of employees. It's a collective agreement, whereas an individual contract is just for individuals. And with an award, a trade union is essential and must be involved in an award, whereas with an individual contract, we can't have a union. They can't be there at all. And finally, an award must be ratified and approved by the Fair Work Commission, whereas an individual contract does not. Lastly, what about the similarities and differences between an enterprise agreement and an individual contract? Again, not a lot of similarities, but we'll start at a base level. Both are employment contracts about wages and conditions, and both must meet the minimum wage and the 10 National Employment Standards. And there's not much other than that to say, but both must pass that better off overall test than what's in the award. A trade union is not essential in their negotiation, so they can be in an enterprise agreement, but that's optional. So I guess we could say another similarity is a trade union is not essential. Well, how are they different? Well, an enterprise agreement applies to all workers in a whole business, whereas an individual contract just applies to one employee within that business. An enterprise agreement is negotiated collectively for a group of employees, whereas an individual contract is negotiated individually. Now, while we said a trade union is not essential is a similarity, there is a difference here because a trade union technically can be involved with an enterprise agreement, but can't be involved in negotiating an individual contract. And finally, an enterprise agreement must be ratified and approved by the Fair Work Commission, but an individual contract does not need to be approved by the Fair Work Commission.